In June of 1986, while trekking alone through the Himalayas, one of the toughest men that the world has ever produced, Reinhold Messner, experienced overwhelming terror when he came face to face with a beast that isn't supposed to exist. Hello, and welcome to Rope. This story is about a man, and it's about a beast and the night that they came face to face. Cries of the Yeti echo through the night, sending terror through the upper reaches of the Himalayan mountains. It stands over 6 feet tall, half man, half beast, and tales of it breaking into homes and carrying off the Sherpa women are still told around the campfires today. And according to people like Sanam Durji, it is very much real, and it is out there.
The creature has always been out there, and it's out there still. If you travel the ancient trails, even today, there's a good chance you'll meet him.
It's been called the abominable snowman, the Himalayan monster, and of course, the Tibetan Yeti. It's a creature or an animal or a cryptid that dwells somewhere deep within the Himalayan mountains, and sightings of it date all the way back to the time of Alexander the Great. Story has it that during his conquest of India around 326 BCE, he and his army repeatedly ran across tales of a huge, fierce, man-like beast with razor-sharp teeth and keen, intelligent eyes. Since then, the legend of the Yeti has grown, and stories of his existence have been found all through history and in every century. But for the most part, it remains elusive, lurking somewhere in the shadows, in the realm of late-night tales and ambiguous folklore, stories told beside the campfire from weary travelers recanting their late-night adventures. That is, until June of 1944, when a lieutenant colonel named Conrad Reginald Cook and his wife were trekking in the Himalayas, and they found a set of oversized prints in the dirt.
We laid Margaret sunglasses beside each print to indicate its size and took photographs. These prints were strange and larger than any normal human foot. 14 inches, heel to toe, with the great toe set back to one side. The first toe, also large, and 3 little toes closely bunched together.
The photos were looked at by several experts, and after careful examination, the print couldn't be matched up to any animal on record, and eventually it was deemed to be either some type of a hoax, a misunderstood print, or an animal track from an unclassified creature or a cryptid that walked upright and stood about 6 feet tall. Then, just 7 years later, while attempting to scale Mount Everest, a man named Eric Shipton took this photograph, which clearly shows what appears to be a footprint with 2 large toes on the right and 3 smaller ones closer together on the left. Not at all that different from the one that Lieutenant Colonel Cook had taken just a few years earlier. Well, once the news of these photographs got out, the region was flooded with droves of self-proclaimed cryptozoologists hoping to get their chance to see the Yeti. And over the next decade, dozens of people came forward sharing evidences that many claim is undeniable proof of the Yeti's existence. So compelling was some of this evidence that the Nepalese government instituted Yeti-related regulations. This official document was sent from the American Embassy in Kathmandu to the State Department in Washington, D.C. on November 13, 1959. In it, it states that, except in self-defense, the Yeti is not to be harmed, and any additional evidence of the Yeti's existence must be turned over to the government of Nepal and under no circumstances is to be given to the press. In this video, we're going to consider the possibility that the Yeti actually does exist, and we'll do this by examining the story of a world-renowned mountain climber named Reinhold Messner, who is undoubtedly one of the toughest men alive, as you'll soon see. We'll first take you through his incredible life, and then we'll share his account in the summer of 1986 while he was trekking alone in the Himalayan mountains, and he came face to face with a Yeti. And we'll tell much of his story using Reinhold's own words. Then I'll take just a second and I'll give you my thoughts on the Yeti. And then Amy is going to come on, and I promise you, you're not going to want to miss this interview. Believe it or not, she's discovered that they've actually done DNA testing on Yeti evidence, and I think you'll be surprised at what they discovered. So, this story begins in the summer of 1944. Reinhold Messner was engineered to be tough. Born in Italy to German-speaking parents, his first night on Earth was literally spent in a World War II air raid. It was Sunday, September 17th, 1944, and according to his sister, it wasn't an easy delivery. He grew up with 8 siblings, a sister and 7 brothers. And at a very young age, he discovered that his biggest love was for the rugged outdoors. And he was only 5 years old when he climbed to his first 3,000-meter peak. As teens, he and his younger brother Gunther climbed every mountain that they could get to. And before long, the news got around that if one wanted to climb any of the nearby mountains, well, Reinhold was the man to see. At 16 years old, he began leading others up mountains, and before he was 20, he, accompanied by his younger brother, had led over 500 ascents. By their mid-20s, the Messner brothers were considered among the best climbers in all of Europe. Then in the late 60s, he juggled mountain climbing with college, and he obtained an archaeological engineering degree from Padua University. And after that, he devoted all of his time to mountain climbing. Then, in 1970, he and his brother joined a major Himalayan expedition where a group of men were planning on scaling the as-yet unclimbed Rupul face of Nanga Parbat. He and his younger brother were the first to make it to the summit, but during their descent, something tragic happened. This climb up to the summit of Nanga Parbat is considered to be one of the most treacherous climbs in the world. It's over 8,000 meters to the top, so along with a myriad of other threatening dangers, there is of course the challenge of diminishing oxygen. The higher that one climbs, the harder it is to breathe. At just 5,000 meters, the atmosphere contains about half the oxygen that it does at sea level. At 6,000, climbers slowly begin to suffocate. And at 7,000 meters, well, survival times plummet and clear thinking becomes almost impossible. By 8,000 meters, the so-called death zone, even the strongest mountaineers can only survive for a very short time. When Reinhold and his brother reached the summit at just over 8,120 meters, Reinhold could tell that his brother had pushed himself too hard, and he was having a very difficult time breathing. So the two men started back down right away, and Reinhold worked as fast as he could to get his brother to the bottom as quickly as possible. But it was already too late, and his brother died on the way down. And because he had focused so much of his energy on his brother, Reinhold cut corners, and he got frostbite, and ultimately he lost 7 toes. Now, for me, that would have been it. Not only must it have been emotionally difficult missing his brother every time that he went climbing and thinking about his brother's death, but how does one climb with only 3 toes? But not Reinhold. That wasn't it at all. He continued to climb and to improve his climbing skills. By 1978, he had climbed the 14 highest mountains in the world. These mountains are extremely dangerous, so much so that in mountain climbing circles, they're known as the 14 8,000ers. That is, of course, because they're all over 8,000 meters, and the tallest mountain in the world, Mount Everest, is one of them. Reinhold climbed to the top of Mount Everest in 1978, and most people bring extra oxygen during this climb because Everest is almost 9,000 meters. But not Reinhold. He climbed to the top without oxygen. And then, just 2 years later, he climbed this mountain again, but this time he climbed it alone, and he went down in history as the first person to do so. If all of this isn't already enough just to show you how insanely tough this man is, well, check this out. He was the first person to cross Antarctica on foot. So, without snowmobiles or dog sleds. Reinhold's life's adventures have been so intense that Amy, this channel's researcher, said this.
I've been the only researcher for this channel, researching various topics even before we became Rope. And during that time, I've researched some pretty fearless characters, ghost hunters, detectives, scientists, and cryptozoologists. But then I came across Reinhold Messner. He's one of the toughest, most badass human beings I've read about thus far. Reinhold Messner is relentless. He takes on what one might consider the most dangerous power on Earth, Mother Nature, at her most brutal locations.
As tough as Reinhold is, he's still human, and anyone can get lost. In July of 1986, Reinhold found himself, as he put it, somewhere in Tibet. He had come to Tibet, this time, to, quote, follow the route that the Sherpa people had taken in their flight from the lands of Daga. As usual, he was trekking alone and on foot, so he was traveling lightly, basically carrying a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a pocket knife, food, and a map. During his hike, he often trekked for days without seeing another person, and during that time, he of course slept out in the elements, usually under a large tree, or if he was lucky, a cave. Obviously, trekking through a vast wilderness is not an easy task, and although he was really good at following a map, sometimes he would find himself a little off track. Well, one particularly grueling afternoon, hoping to get to the village of Chagu before sundown, he found himself on the wrong side of a river. He wasn't exactly sure where he was, but he knew that he had to get on the other side of that river, and the river was wide. He knew that he could not swim across it and bring his supplies, but it looked like it just might be shallow enough where he could walk across. Oh, but it was cold, and the current? It was much stronger than he had thought.
The frigid water was gray as fog, and the spray tasted of rock and dirty snow. I could not feel my legs below my knees, but my face was covered with sweat.
After crossing the river, he continued into the forest, racing against the clock, trying to beat the setting sun, and after a bit of climbing, he started to feel apprehensive. None of the trails on the map were showing up anywhere in the forest. There was nothing to indicate whether or not he was on the right track. Lost is what he was. So he just kept moving. And it was just about dusk when, in this strange, unfamiliar place, all of the sounds of nature suddenly went quiet, and the forest became eerily silent.
I saw what I thought might be a mountain path not far from where I was, so I moved towards it and began to climb faster. My pace almost became mechanical, and after a few minutes, I emerged into a clearing. This was unquestionably the trail that I had anxiously been searching for. I followed it without hesitation, making my way up to where I thought Chagu must be.
The closer he got to Chagu, the more excited Reinhold got. But then, suddenly, as silent as a ghost, something large and dark stepped out of the forest and onto the path, just 30 feet ahead of him.
My first thought was, this must be a yak, and I started to get excited at the thought of meeting some Tibetans and getting a hot meal and a place to sleep. But the thing stood still. Then, light-footedly and noiselessly, it raced back into the forest and disappeared, but almost immediately it reappeared. It was moving fast and picking up speed. Neither branches nor ditches slowed it down. At that moment, I realized it wasn't a yak.
Reinhold was deep in the Himalayan mountains, lost, looking for the village of Chagu, when something large and dark had crossed his path.
The fast-moving silhouette dashed behind a curtain of leaves and branches, just to step out into a clearing some 10 yards further, and only a second later. It moved upright, like a person, and just for a heartbeat it stood motionless, then turned away and disappeared into the dusk. I waited for a second, expecting to hear it make some sound, but there was nothing. The forest remained silent. No stones rolled down the slope, no twigs snapped. I'm not sure, but I thought I heard a few soft footfalls in the grayness of the underbrush in the distance. I stared at the spot where this apparition had been, first amazed and then perplexed. I pondered, standing stock still, listening to the silence.
By this point, the sun had already set, and Reinhold was standing in the dark, completely alone, miles away from another human being. And even if this thing wasn't something supernatural or an unclassified cryptid, it was large, and apparently it was moving upright on two legs. If it decided to attack, there would be very little that Reinhold could do to defend himself, and with how fast it was moving, there was absolutely no way he'd be able to outrun it. But Reinhold, different than most other men, wasn't afraid. Yet. And after a few minutes without it re-emerging or making any other sounds, Reinhold decided to follow it.
I crept into the undergrowth where the creature had disappeared, noting everything that moved, listening for every sound, paying attention to every scent that came from the forest floor. After a minute, I found something in the dirt.
There, right below him in the black clay, Reinhold found a gigantic footprint, and it was absolutely distinct. Even the toes were unmistakable.
Staring at the print, I suddenly remembered the famous photograph Eric Shipton had taken of an overly large footprint in 1951. His photograph was commonly considered the best proof that a creature known as the Yeti existed.
Reinhold had heard the tales of the Yeti, how they would kidnap the Sherpa women and kill yaks with a single blow. But he was an educated man, and never in a million years did he ever believe that the stories could actually be true. But now he began to wonder. Finding no further sign of the animal, he went back to the path and continued his trek toward Chagu. And all along the way, of course, he continued to look for more tracks. And eventually, he found some, and he followed them.
Making my way through a set of juniper bushes, I suddenly heard an eerie sound. A whistling noise, similar to the warning call mountain goats make. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw an outline of an upright figure dart between the trees at the edge of the clearing where the low-growing thickets covered the steep slope. The figure hurried on, silently and hunched forward, disappearing behind a tree, only to reappear again against the moonlight.
Finally, Reinhold was becoming afraid. His heart was racing, and there was a lump in his throat. And if he could go somewhere, he would. But there was nowhere to go.
It stopped and looked at me. Again, I heard a whistle, or more like an angry hiss. And for a heartbeat, I saw eyes and teeth. The creature towered menacingly, its face a gray shadow, its body a black outline, It was covered with hair, and it stood upright on two short legs. It had powerful arms that hung down almost to its knees. I guessed it to be over 7 feet tall. Its body looked much heavier than that of a man that size, but it moved with such agility and power that it was clearly not human. No human would have been able to run like that.
The beast stood there, face to face with Reinhold, only yards away for what felt like forever. Then, finally, it relinquished its gaze and moved back into the brush. A heavy stench hung in the air as the creature's resounding calls echoed into the distance.
I heard it plunge into the thicket, saw it rush up the slope on all fours, higher and higher, deeper into the mountains until it disappeared.
Reinhold stared at the spot where the creature had just been standing, and his hands were shaking. That was the closest that Reinhold would ever get to the Yeti, and he spent the next several years trying to make sense of what happened that night. And being the type of man that he is, he didn't just ponder it. He actually went out looking for it. And although that night he was 100% certain that he had come face to face with the Yeti, over the years, after tracking it and studying it, he now believes that what he saw was an unclassified bear. Society's idea of the Yeti, of course, is that it is nothing more than a creature that lives in the folklore of our imaginations, spurred on by late-night tales and misunderstood sightings. But for a few brief moments that night in July of 1986, one of the toughest and most experienced mountain men in the world knew that those tales were true. Does the Yeti exist? I don't know. You know, it reminds me of the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot in North America, and most of the world would say that those creatures don't exist. Still, the lore has to come from somewhere. Amy discovered that they've actually done DNA testing on the Yeti. So, you wanted to talk about some DNA samples that they did on the Yeti?
Yeah, I do, but I got to give you a little bit of a backstory first, okay?
Sure.
All right. I believe it was May 14th, 2012. The Museum of Zoology in Switzerland and Oxford University in England held a joint press release. And basically, they said, send us samples of anomalous primate hairs. Right? So basically, send us hair samples from your Yeti, Bigfoot, and Sasquatch.
It's like a field day for cryptozoologists.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
This is cool. Okay, so what happened?
All right. So they did DNA, RNA testing, all sorts of things.
Okay.
Okay. So they came up with results that stated most of these are from sheep, bear, wolves, common animals.
Yeah, but you said most.
I did. You always catch on. I can't ever put you in suspense.
Well, I'm actually literally sitting on the edge of my seat right now.
Okay. So there were 2 hair samples that did not match any living animal.
What?
Yes. So they found that these 2 samples, which were numbered 25025 and 25191, were from regions in the Himalayas.
Okay.
Okay.
Only gets better.
It only gets better. Sample 25025 was submitted by a very respectable French researcher who said that hair came from a carcass of an animal that was killed more than 40 years ago. The second 25191, well, that came from an area that is protected in Bhutan. What they released is that it came from a nest of what the Bhutanese people call a Yeti.
What?
I know, right?
Okay, so a minute ago you said that from animals that were not alive today.
Yes.
So I take it that we do have on record an animal from the past that that matched this DNA?
Yeah, real recent, 40,000 years ago, the Pleistocene era. So the hairs from those two specimens matched. Like I said, an animal from the Pleistocene era, 40,000 years ago, of a polar bear.
Both of those.
Both.
Oh my God.
Both. Yeah. And what?
A polar bear.
Okay, yes.
So a polar bear in this sanctuary for the Yeti in the Himalayan mountains.
Right, right. But even the scientist said this is truly strange, anomalous, right? Because supposedly these animals were extinct 40,000 years ago.
Obviously not.
And the hair samples don't match any polar bear that we have on record today.
Right.
Anywhere.
But it does match one from 40,000 years ago.
Right.
That's crazy.
It is. It's very interesting.
So, like I always do, I have to ask you. So, what do you think about the story about Messner? I know that you were like blown away at how tough this guy was.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that you really thought was, wow, this guy. But so, what did you think about his experience that night?
I think that he saw something. It does make me think. I bet there's something out there that we just haven't cataloged yet. I thought about that animal, the okapi, right? That looks like, I think, part deer and part zebra. And the first reports out of Africa were like, we've seen this animal. And, the general consensus was, okay, sure, wink, wink. And then we found it.
So you think maybe somewhere out there could be a Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch thing?
I do. I think especially in the remote area of the Himalayas.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
40,000 years ago. Now, how did he get that DNA? This report reminds me of the story of Christine Ann. She was an adventurous 10-year-old who got lost in the West Virginia forest and came face to face with what she said was an intelligent-looking dog. She said that it was standing upright just feet from where she was. And then, get this, she said that she saw it again 3 decades later when she was driving down a dark road in Arizona. Unlike Reinhold, she of course was terrified. She wrote a book about it, and Amy was actually able to speak with her over the phone. Her story is extremely fascinating. We did a complete report on it. If you'd like to see it, it's here.
Hey guys, if you want to be a knot in our rope, go to the link somewhere on this page and support us. It's at Buy Me a Coffee.
That's right, but you can just buy anything you want. Actually, it's just a donation, or you can become a member.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.